Hello. Well, one of the big topics of contemporary historiography, writing about history, is that of imperialism and empire. You could fill a fair-sized library with books about the history of not just the British Empire, but all the other great European colonial empires. As we'll see, though, empire is actually a central feature of human history for a lot longer than the modern world. And it's also a feature of history that economics has something to say about. And the economics of empire are actually both interesting and not at all what popular opinion holds them to be. In fact, the kind of general view that you get of the economics of empire, including in a lot of the historiography, is one which is actually mistaken and which we can trace back to one particular book published in the very early part of the 20th century. So let's then have a look at what in fact is going on with empire in history. So, what could we say then about the economics and economic history of imperialism? Well, let's start off with some basic facts about empires. First of all, empires have existed throughout history in all parts of the world. Imperialism, aggressive imperialism, is not something that's confined to European history. The Chinese Empire doubled its size, for example, in the 17th and 18th centuries, very aggressively. There have been many other historically large empires founded in parts of the world other than Europe. The Mughal Empire, for example, the Great Arab Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And so empires are a central feature of human history. And as it says here, it's the form of government that the majority of the people who've ever lived have lived under. Most of the people who have lived in the past were subjects of empires rather than of other kinds of state. Now, an empire can be defined very simply and straightforwardly. It's a policy, a political system, in which one people, or more accurately, as we'll see, a part of that one people, rules over many other peoples. And this is why we speak of things like the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, and so on, because the people mentioned in the title are, of course, the imperial people, the one who are ruling over the rest. Now, a central part of empire is wealth extraction from the subject peoples. If you look at the history of empires, you can think of empires as being essentially like a wealth pump, which takes resources, wealth, income, away from the subject peoples and locates it into the ruling people. But this is not done in a straightforward way. And when you start to look at it, it's actually much more complicated than you might imagine. Also, very importantly, empires are extremely expensive. They cost a lot to acquire, and they cost even more to keep and run. And they have very, very bad economic results for most of the people involved. Now, what is the economic theory of empires? Well, one of the things to realize is that historically, most economists, and in particular classical liberal economists, are very, very strongly anti-imperialist. Adam Smith, for example, was strongly opposed to the colonial system, as it was called in his time. And in fact, one of the central elements of the Wealth of Nations is a powerful critique of the whole colonial system in its economic aspects. Malthus was also an opponent of imperialism and of colonialism, both of the settler and the conquering variety. The great 19th century classical liberal Herbert Spencer was also a vehement opponent of imperialism and famously refused to sign petitions in favor of the British side in the first Afghan war. Richard Cobden, the great leader of the free trade cause in mid-19th century England, was also totally opposed to imperialism throughout his career in politics and even before he entered politics. Now, the liberal theory of the economics of empire, which was developed during the 18th and 19th centuries, was given its kind of final form by the liberal socialist J.A. Hobson in a book published right at the start of the 20th century called Imperialism. And in this, Hobson developed an analysis which I'm going to set out in a moment. However, what happened was that his book was taken up and then rejigged, if you will, and changed by no less a person than Lenin. In one of Lenin's most famous books, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Now, that book of Lenin's is the one that drives most of the accounts of the economics of empire that you will come across in university courses and in a lot of the historiography. But what Lenin did was to, if you like, give the account given by Hobson a bit of a twist. Because what Lenin wanted to do was to explain how and why it was that the revolution that Marx had predicted would happen in capitalist economies had not taken place by the 1900s and showed no signs of doing so. And Lenin's answer was, in part, that what imperialism did was to yield enormous streams of income, which the capitalist classes in the metropoles, the imperialist countries, used to buy off the workers in those countries by giving them various kinds of top-ups and benefits. And so imperialism was for him the stage of capitalism in which capitalism was beginning to face problems, but was winning itself extra time through imperialist exploitation. Now, Hobson did not see it that way. For him, the main point he made was that most people, and above all the working and middle classes of capitalist countries, did not benefit from imperialism. But he did think, as we'll see, that some people benefited, but he didn't draw the conclusions that Lenin did. So you need to be aware that there is a liberal theory of imperialism, a classical liberal one, founded upon classical economics, which is different from the Leninist one that derives from it, but which has a rather different take, and that's the one that you tend to find in the books. So what about the economics of imperialism and of empires? Well, as it said a moment ago, empires involve transferring wealth from people in the subject parts of the empire to people in the metropole. But the key thing there is the word in brackets. What happens is that most of the people in the subject parts have wealth taken off them and transferred on net, but it doesn't go to the general population of the metropole. The bulk of the population of the imperial power actually do not benefit from the empire. It's only a minority of the metropolitan population, the imperial nation's population, that gain net from empire. Now, the empire, as I said earlier, is very expensive. And it's very economically damaging, both to the subject parts of it and ultimately to the metropolitan part of the empire. The costs involve things like maintaining an extremely large military, much larger than you would otherwise need, diverting all kinds of resources, as we'll see. Now, who then is gaining? If it's not the majority of the population of the metropolitan power, who is gaining? Cui bono, as the question has it, and the answer is here, and it's spelt out very clearly in Hobson's book. It's the ruling elite of the metropole who gain, the ruling circles, if you like, the aristocracy, the government, the bureaucracy, and also key economic groups that are closely connected to the imperial state and which benefit from things like advantageous trade conditions, military spending, and the kind of jobs that are created in the bureaucracy of the imperial government. So they are the winners. Those are the some people in the population of the imperial power for whom empire is a very good deal. For everybody else, it's a bad deal. Now, empire then has all kinds of damaging economic effects. Now, the obvious one is the plunder and sometimes outright slavery imposed upon the subject populations. So the British Empire in the 18th century, for example, and well into the 19th century, involved systematic use of plantation slavery in places like the Caribbean, obviously gross violation of human rights and exploitation of the slave population. There's also outright plunder. And if you look at the history of the British in India, particularly when it's the East India Company, but even after the ending of the East India Company, you'll find just straightforward plunder and robbery of the population of places like Bengal or what is now Chennai, Madras. You have people like Robert Clive and the so-called nabobs, people who made a fortune in India, not out of trade, but out of basically robbing and plundering the local population. This is obviously highly damaging. and there's no need to disguise this or even to come up with any fancy explanation. But there's also less obvious ways in which the economics of empire have damaging effects. And these are the ones here. One is the one I've already mentioned, the military costs. Why does the United Kingdom, for example, have such an enormous navy in the 19th century? It's because it needs one for imperial reasons, not because it needs such a large navy to defend the British Isles. It leads to the benefiting of rent-seeking elites, groups who are not actually contributing anything to total wealth creation, but who are gaining money through the unearned income that they get from military connections and military contracts, or unfair trade benefits that they gain by virtue of being connected to the imperial government. They are basically a parasitic class, in other words. Also, what empire does, and this is perhaps the most serious economic consequence of empire, for the metropole in particular, is that it diverts capital and it redirects trade to less valuable outcomes and patterns. In other words, if the empire was not there, if this political system was not in place, investment would not take the form and shape that it did. And trade would also not take the form and pattern that it did. And the pattern that it does take in both cases is therefore suboptimal. It's less productive than it would otherwise be. And it's taking that path because of the artificial supernormal profits that arise out of the political relationship of empire. And lastly, empires pervert institutions with very harmful effects. Essentially, if you're going to get into the empire business, there are certain things that follow from that naturally. One is quite severe repression and violation of human rights and the rule of law in your treatment of the subject populations. The trouble is that this leads to people in power getting both powers and attitudes that are extremely harmful and which they tend to then import back home into the metropole. So the way they treat the population of the subject parts of the empire tends to be transferred to the way the domestic population is treated, or certainly any part of it that causes trouble. In addition, also, even if the imperial power tries to be more benign and adopts a position of patronizing paternalism towards its imperial subjects, which was the case latterly in the British Empire, what you find is that that similar attitude of coercive paternalism is then applied equally to domestic populations. And in fact, the growth of the modern state in Britain is in many ways driven by the growth of institutions of imperial governance in places like India and elsewhere. And the style of administration and governance that was developed to deal with India was then applied to people like the inhabitants of the East End or the working class districts of the north of England. And this is an example of the way in which the practice of empire corrupts what the 19th century liberal critics of empire called the institutions of free governance. Now, let's look at the specific case of the British Empire, because this is the one that you'll see most. It's partly driven by trade policies. The reason why the empire is acquired is partly due initially to the trade doctrine of mercantilism, which Adam Smith spends quite a bit of time attacking and demolishing in The Wealth of Nations. Latterly, you get the phenomenon of what some historians call free trade imperialism, which is where the idea is to use political power to open up trade advantages for favoured British merchants and other industrial groups. These are not good policies, because what they do is to actually divert the resources and the pattern of trade away from its economically best shape and type. And so therefore that's an example of the bad effects. But increasingly, the British Empire in particular was driven by geopolitics and grand strategy. The acquisition of huge territories in Africa, for example, was not motivated by economic concerns. It was motivated simply by the need to protect the sea route to India, and by the need to control the Nile Valley and thereafter the route down the Great Lakes, down the eastern side of Africa. So in other words, it becomes almost like an end in itself, in which the more empire you have, the more you need to have to make it secure. And this is, as I've said before, really, really expensive. The British Empire has to maintain a whole string of naval bases all around the world, as well as a navy as big as the next three biggest navies in the world put together, which, as you can imagine, is seriously costly, even for an extremely wealthy and powerful country like the United Kingdom. Most of the British Empire makes a loss economically. The figures here are very clear, and most historians will agree with this. In fact, virtually all will. Most of the colonies are loss-making propositions. They don't make, the sums simply do not add up. If you think about the cost they impose on the British Treasury in terms of not just military spending, but other kinds of spending, and then look at the economic benefit they bring, it's all in the red. The one partial exception is India, but if you look at India, at best it breaks even. When you look at the cost of the investment in India and the enormous military cost of defending it, including the cost of the Indian army, even though that's borne by Indian taxpayers rather than British taxpayers, it just about breaks even. And if you're looking at it in the round, rather than just from the point of view of the British rule over India has devastating effects on the Indian economy up until about the very end of the 19th century. Not deliberately, actually, increasingly, but due to the monetary policy followed by the British government, which imposed very severe deflation upon the Indian economy for the bulk of the 19th century. And that was what, in fact, wrecked a lot of the rural economy of places like Bengal under British rule. What this also did, though, was to create extremely powerful rent-seeking interests in British societies. Favoured manufacturing groups, such as shipyards that basically made a living out of building ships for the Royal Navy, for example, but also an enormous interest amongst the upper classes of the British society at the time, of people who had employment in jobs in the imperial bureaucracy, in the Indian civil service and the like, and also financial interests that gained from the artificial capital flows that the empire created, which otherwise would not have existed. And these rent-seeking interests, in turn, had a distorting effect upon British domestic economic policy and turned it in directions that were actually ultimately not in the interests of the British population as a whole. And if you look at the pattern of UK trade and investment between 1870 to 1940, the highlight of the British Empire, what you'll see there is that the empire is an also-ran. The major trading partner for the United Kingdom in this period, and the major place where most British investment went, was the United States. The second biggest place, which may surprise you, was Germany. India is way down the list. It comes in 5th or 6th, depending on how you calculate it. And in fact, the British Empire gets a relatively small share of both British investment and British trade, which again confirms the fact that it's basically a loss-making proposition for all but a special privileged part of British society. And what is true about the British Empire is true even more so for other historical major empires, whether European or non-European. So that is the account of the economics of empire. Basically, there's a very simple conclusion you can draw from this. Empires are bad news economically for almost everybody. They are very good news, however, for small, privileged interest groups, ruling classes, basically, and they are the ones who typically are responsible for both launching empires and imperial ventures and keeping them going.